Welcome to another installment of Lectures by Lob-EZ. I'm your host, Donnie Lee. Seems Dr. Lob-EZ is on special assignment, being called to Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, to consult with Drs. Fauci and Birx. Anyway, he asked me if I sit in for him and talk about the Great Famine. So that's what I'm fixing to do. We're talking European history, dates 1315 to 1322. So we're going to talk about some climatic challenges that affected Europe during the 14th century. And in particular, we're talking about the three-field system, something called the Little Ice Age, and then the Great Famine. All right. So prior to this time period, if we go all the way back to the Middle Ages, let's just say year 1000 to 1300, there's a tremendous amount of population growth throughout Europe. And what you see here on this map is not only a map of Europe, which throughout the course of this course, you're going to learn more about that geography. But what you see here located throughout the continent are all the different universities. And so what that's evidence of is learning and trade and commerce and cultural diffusion. And a lot of times people refer to this time period as the Dark Ages. But what this map kind of helps dispel is that this time period was anything but dark. But anyway, there's a period of growth during this time period, and we're going to talk about like why that happened. All right. Well, some of it has to do with this, with the climate. Okay, and look at this. It says during the years 1000 to about 1400, something like that, there was a global period of global warming. Wait a minute, this can't be right. I thought global warming was happening today. Well, I guess back then they had global warming too, but they didn't have cars and factories and stuff, so I wonder why. Well, anyway, we're not going to talk about that, but I guess because of increased temperatures, more crops were able to grow, and that might have been part of the reason why the population of Europe increased. But anyway, farmers began to respond to the increased demand for crops and stuff like that by trying to bring more and more land under cultivation. Okay, and so what you see here in this little painting is some farmers, some peasants, probably tilling the land. And this fellow in the back, he seems to be throwing some seeds into the land that has just been plowed. That's called broadcasting, y'all. When you broadcast the seeds, that means you're throwing them into the holes, hoping that they're gonna germinate. But looks like they're doing battle with some of these birds. Birds are eating them seeds too. But anyway, there were some technological innovations that made it possible for these farmers to produce more food. Okay, namely the fact that they were able to develop some harnesses for these here horses. Because prior to that, they used to use a team of oxen, and those big animals are clumsy, and it's more difficult to plow a field with oxen than it is with horses. All right, so when they developed a harness that was capable, that allowed them to hitch horses to it, to a plow, that led to an improvement. Okay, as did the iron plowshare. And what is an iron plowshare? Well, iron is a metal, all right, and the plowshare is like the tip of the blade that goes into the soil and makes it a little bit easier to plow the field. So before, they probably used some kind of stone or even wood, but now they're going to iron. So that made farming more productive. So anytime you see technological innovations applied to a specific area, usually you get improvements or an increase in production of some sort. All right, so this next one here, we're going to see how the effect. Okay, so first things first, if we look, wait a minute, I don't want it. let's talk about the three-field system. All right, so that was another innovation. All right, that took place around 800, 900 AD, roughly. Okay, so prior to this time period, farmers used to take a very simple approach to their farming. They divide all the land, all the arable land in their village, and they would either plant it or not. Okay, and the reason why they wouldn't plant it or allow the field to remain fallow, that means resting. They did that because if they kept planting crops over and over again in their various fields, then sooner or later the nutrients going to be stripped from the soil, and guess what, y'all? You're not going to get no more crops. So what they would do is they would allow the fields to rest. So that means 50% of the land was never cultivated on any given time period. So what does that mean? That means they can't produce too much food. See what I'm saying? So like, what would they do with that fallow land, you might ask? Well, they just like let weeds grow on it or something, and then they'd allow their livestock to go out there and feed on that grass. And you know what they would do is they would go to the bathroom and whatnot, and that would help fertilize the soil and kind of restore it. All right, and so the next year they can return to growing crops on it. Well, just so you know, that's a very inefficient system. And so over time, starting in around 800, they came up with the three-field system. And what's that, you ask? Well, instead of leaving 50% of the land fallow, they only left a third. Okay, so that's like 33 1/3%, something like that. So that meant 67% of the land, the vast majority of the land, was in cultivation. And so what they would do is, not only would they be able to plant, more crops, they could plant different crops. So like on one field, they would plant some kind of grain like wheat or oats or barley, and then on the other one, they would plant some kind of vegetable. All right, primarily like peas or I don't know, maybe broccoli or some kind of green leafy vegetable. So this meant that land is more land was cultivated, more food meant a growing population. So presto, look at this little graph down at the bottom. All right, so what does it say? What's it show? It shows that the population grew from the year 800 to 1300. Okay, and the number that we're looking at is 75 million. Okay, so you need to know at the beginning of this course, the population of Europe was 75 million. What's the population of Europe today? In case you don't know, it's a little over 500 million. Okay, but 75 million. All right, so the beginning of this course, 1300, 1350, 14th century, population in Europe was 75 million. Everybody remember that? Okay, because that's important. That's a little factoid you're going to need to remember. All right, so what else? Well, when that population reached about 75 million, that again began to put some strain even on even due to the the cultural, the technological innovations. Despite that, there was still pressure being placed on the farmers. There was still a growing demand for food, and they couldn't produce enough food. Okay, and so what that means is the price of food is going to go up. So that's going to make bread and things like that more expensive for the common folk, and they're not always going to be able to afford it. And it just means that there's not enough food to go around. Okay, and that means that if there happened to be a crop failure, then famine was right around the corner. All right, famine. What is famine? Famine is starvation. Okay, and what they used to be able to do is, even if they had a crop failure, they could rely on excess surplus food that might have been left over from the year prior. Okay, well, since starting around 1300, they weren't always able to produce enough surplus food. So in the event of a crop failure, it was highly likely that a famine would ensue. All right, does that make sense? And just so we know, right around this time period, crops failed about once every 4 years. Okay, so twice a decade, people once or twice a decade, people are dealing with those crop failures and famines. All right, so that's no good. So So what we see starting in the year 1310, look at that little movie poster for that movie Ice Age. I guess we was going to talk about the Ice Age then. Well, starting in 1310, it says lands were drenched. Okay, so I guess the history of it is during this time period, we see a cooling of the Earth's surface, especially in Europe. Okay, so the medieval warming period ends, and so the temperatures begin to drop. Okay, all the way up to, looks like to me to be about the 20th century. All right, and that's about the same time that people started saying there was global warming. All right, so maybe there is probably global warming, but I guess the big question is how much of it is man-made and how much of it is what you call like just history and stuff like that. I don't want to get too political, but so I'm not going to talk about that much more. Anyway, so I guess the Ice Age began because there was too much rain, and the rain caused the temperatures to dip. And you know, when you have too much rain, you think as a farmer that's a good thing. Well, too much of a good thing can be a bad thing, and so you end up having flood and stuff like that, and so you get crop failures. All right. So all over Europe, we start to see cases of temperatures dropping significantly, and this is important too. Greenland, all right. Greenland is not at all green. It's a piece of a very large piece of land that is kind of like a colony of Denmark, in case you didn't know. And where is Greenland? Well, it's kind of like in between Canada and the rest of Northern Europe. But anyway, you know, the Vikings established colonies there way back in the year 1000. And what we see is them Vikings, it got too doggone cold for them starting in the 14th century, and they just got on out of there. All right, and they abandoned their colonies. Okay, so that's important to note. So that must mean it's cold. All right, so in particular, the year 1315, 1322 was called a Great Famine. All right, and so the famine refers to something biblical, 7 lean years. Okay, so in the Bible, in the Old Testament, in the book of Genesis, they talked about you know, around the time of Abraham and his sons, Isaac, and oh gosh, I think there was a fella named Joseph, and he had this multicolored coat. Well, anyway, they talked about the 7 lean years. Okay, well, at any rate, people oftentimes will, you know, when they don't really understand a phenomena that's taking place in history, or, you know, while they're living. So during this time period, people didn't really understand science too much. Okay, so they just know that people were dying, people were starving to death, there was a famine, there were crop failures, and oftentimes when people do that, they kind of get a little superstitious, and they kind of think that maybe God is punishing them, right? So maybe because of their wickedness, God has decided to smite mankind. And so anyway, that's part of the reason why it was kind of nicknamed the 7 lean years, because a lot of people thought that God was punishing them. But that we now know that it was, you know, due to crop failures, and it was just a kind of part of a larger global cooling period. But anyway, what you see, all these people who fell out, and even these animals all keeled over. This is a castle, you know, so this is a medieval time period, and these people are covered with all these bumps. Okay, some kind of disease or something. So it just means that people, when you're starving, you are more susceptible to catch diseases. Okay, so that is important to note. So people are dying because they're starving, but they're also dying because of diseases. And why are they catching these diseases? Well, they're catching them because they don't have very good medical care back then. They got bad sanitation, bad hygiene. All of that's true, but the point is, their immune systems are weak because they're hungry, they're half starved. All right, and so if the starvation or the famine didn't get them, then these diseases would. So that's not good. And they say that during this time period, the Great Famine, about 10% of the Europe's population died. So do some math. Well, you were like, well, Mr. Lob-EZ, Dr. Lob-EZ, or Donnie Lee, I thought this was history class and not math class. Well, we'll do a little of that. So the population was 75 million. That means 7.5 million people died during this time period. And look, here's a little, let's see, a little graph or something like that, graphic that shows chart showing all the different cities throughout Europe, and not cities but countries, and how their towns, the number of towns that exceeded 10,000 dropped significantly. Okay, and that's due to the famine. All right, so one of the things I want to talk about too is that population decline was the groups that got hit the hardest were the old people and then them babies. Okay, the babies and the old people, we call them the bookends of a society, right? And why is it that their numbers were so high? Well, because they're most vulnerable. Just think about it. Little babies, they're very vulnerable, and sometimes they die. They get sick and they die. And the same thing that can happen when you get older, just like with this COVID-19. The people who are most at risk, they say, are people over the age of 70 or 80, right? And that's because they have weaker immune systems at that time. So anyway, people who died, the young and the old died at higher rates. And look at here, it says some of the consequences of the Great Famine was that not just the population declined, but people turned to cannibalism. That's when you eat other people. That's gross. Not natural, but sometimes, I guess in the case of emergency, some people resort to that. They say that's one of the worst ways to go, to die of starvation, because you kind of lose your mind, and it's a very long, drawn-out process. All right. So anyway, it also led people to move around. People turned to a life of crime. People postponed marriages, but overall there was a decline in population. And then here we have these fellas here. They look to be Jewish fellas, and they've been thrown into this pot, and they're going to be cooked alive. I don't know if that actually happened or if that was just some kind of artist's, interpretation of it. But what we're talking about is anti-Semitism, y'all, and that's hatred of Jews. And so, because people didn't know what was causing this, the diseases and the crop failures, people turned to, they targeted Jews. Why? Because Jews are a small segment of the population in Europe at this time. They're considered a minority group, and sometimes minority groups are scapegoated by the majority. It's not going to be the last example, but that's the first example of it. But we'll talk about it quite a bit throughout this course, and I'll actually get into the nature of the hatred that Europeans sometimes had for Jews, like where does it all come from. But anyway, there were stories or rumors going around that the Jews and then their helpers, the lepers, were trying to kill Christians by poisoning the wells. So that led to some anti-Semitism. That word's not in the notes here, but that's what it's called. It's hatred of Jews, and it led to violence against the Jews as well. All right. So the last thing I want to talk about is government's response to the Great Famine. And we're just going to know that the government's response was not very effective. Okay, so here's a map of Europe, 950 to 1300. This will be, this is a good, nice little map to show for the beginning of this course. You might not be familiar with all the territories, but you will throughout the course of this year. Right here in the middle is something called the Holy Roman Empire. Oftentimes it's referred to as Germany because the people, many of the people who lived in this area were German. Okay, we're not going to talk about them right now. We're going to talk about England and France, and how the kings of England and the kings of France attempted to deal with this kind of epidemic, epidemic by forcing or preventing people from charging too high of prices, by preventing people from selling grains overseas where they might be able to get a higher price, so to keep their own population well fed, and stuff like that. But the point of it is, both in France and England, the efforts of the kings mostly failed. They were able maybe to provide a little bit of relief as far as getting food out to their subjects, but not very well. Okay, and the reason being is because at this time period, the kings were very weak. Right, this time period is also sometimes called feudal, the feudal age, or feudalism, and we'll talk a little bit as time goes on about that political system known as feudalism. But just understand that in this system, kings are weak. All right, they don't have a whole lot of power, and so they were sort of powerless when it came to dealing with this epidemic. Okay, so that's pretty much it for this topic. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for future videos by Dr. Lob-EZ.